Hi, my name's Huxley. I'm here with Future Music in my studio near Brighton, and today we're going to check out my track Evolution, which is my next release on Knee Deep in Sound. So this is Evolution. As you can see, it's kind of me going back to my old style, which is quite a few channels and different things going on. Kind of wrote this at a time where I was getting a bit sick of music that basically didn't have any melody or music in it, or house music anyway. But I still wanted the track to have quite a lot of girth and chug to it. But then I also wanted to include kind of an epic kind of sequence in it, which I've used strings and piano for, which I'll go into a bit later. But the way I actually started this record was, which is how I normally start my record, is kind of just get the kick drum going. So for this, I literally just play it through. I use the Logic sampler for it, still, called Ultra Beat. I put each kind of, if it's not audio, then I'll just use one of these for each sound. I don't particularly like lining them all up in one machine because I feel like it doesn't give me enough kind of influence over them with EQs and effects and all that kind of thing. And it's very basic for my kicks, really. A little bit of a notch, depends on the kick. Here, obviously, it's around 63, but it could be anywhere really, just to add a bit more sub to it, a bit more of that bottom. And then also, I use these on pretty much every channel, actually. I love this thing. It's a very kind of, it's the Waves SSL channel strip, and it's pretty self-explanatory. You've got the 4 bands of EQ, and then it's also got a little compressor and just a high and low pass filter on there. And I just like the ease of use of this and the fact that it's condensed and all together. I mean, I often do add another compressor and other stuff as well. Again, this is just the Logic one. Not too much going on there, a little bit of threshold. Bring the attack right down to give it a bit more of that just instant punch. And again, for this kick, it's quite a good, for me, I kind of prefer finding a nice kick rather than pissing around and doing too much to it, because I find you can just get lost in that for hours, which I have done in the past. Also, you might be able to see that there's 2 channels. This is essentially me just being lazy and not being bothered to do automation, and it's just with the bottom cut off. And then if we play kind of the drop, this is how I sort of started. This is where I built it up from. Now, something that is a bit different in this track is, as well as using melody, I used to use a lot of samples. Not necessarily like this, but I've got back into using samples and loops, and I have to shout out to Splice because that's kind of the thing that's done it. Also, my sample CD's out now, go and check it out. But for this one, I've just taken a bass loop and I've cut it up into the melody that I wanted it, and I've then rebounced it in after I've taken all the tops off, and just kind of made it a subby kind of chuggy bass line, using the Waves R bass as well to add a tiny bit more kind of, again, girth to it, I suppose. And it just kind of, I found that rather than spending hours using, a soft synth or just a single sample, I actually found that I could create the effect I wanted just looping a tiny little bit of a loop and sort of putting it around. At the end of the day, if you do it creatively, there's nothing to say that's any less creative if it gets you to the end point that you want to go to. I think these days people are a bit too worried about all that kind of stuff. Again, not much on the EQ here. I have probably EQ'd this actually before I resampled it. Unfortunately, I've kind of deleted that channel, so I can't show it, but not much again. I mean, it's just about adding that bottom end to the thing. I think that's kind of the most important thing in house music, to have a good chuggy, thick bottom end with the kick and the bass. In terms of other hats, something I have started using a lot recently on my hats to add a bit more punch is this transient master. Now, transients are something that I've always just kind of edited myself in a sampler or something, but I found that this kind of, you know, it adds an instant punch and it makes it really kind of stick out in the mix compared to like just leaving it how it is and just shortening it a little bit. Nothing too complex there really. A bit of plate reverb, something that just comes to Logic, and then I EQ off the high and the lows so it doesn't clash. I try and, if it's not the kick or the bass, I normally try and get rid of not this much, but pretty much all the kind of bottom end below about 30 or 50 on most of the sounds, to be honest. Just so things don't clash down there, and you know, just so that bottom end is free to do what it needs to do and not get muddled up by it. So I started this, just started with a kick and the bass, rolling. Knew that was already a pretty good groove, pretty static, but it kind of does what it needs to do. And then just start building up sounds. Again with a clap, roll off that bottom end and put the transient on. Also with the clap, I've started using this distortion, overdrive distortion. The Logic one is perfect for this. I don't really think you need to complicate things. Obviously if you use Ableton, maybe there's something in there, I don't know, I don't use it. But just a little tiny bit of that distortion, mess about with the tone. The distortion allows things to kind of punch through, a bit like the transient, but can just add an extra layer of kind of grit to things as well, which I quite like in my music. I kind of like some sort of raw elements to it. Again, it's just a lot, and then I started building up some loops for this. As long as you're not basing your whole track on a predisposed loop mastered loop, or you know, taking everything and you're just kind of using things to fill the space, I don't think there's any problem with it. Like, people might disagree with me, I don't know, maybe we've got past that stigma these days. Back in the day, I can remember people used to really have a problem with using loops. Personally, if it can help you fill out the space. Here I've just used two kind of basic just loops that add a little bit to the groove, but really just kind of fill in spaces. Also, you know, a lot of these loops, they've already had processing and stuff already, so again, just use the SSL, tiny bit of EQing, and then also, I do this a lot, especially with percussion, is using sidechain. I have it set up a bit arse backwards, to be honest. I have it running to a bus, which has a kick running all the way through, and my friend thinks this is an awful way of doing it, and I should just do it in a completely different way. But you know, I've done this since I was 17, 18, ever since I started using Logic, so I'm kind of, you can't teach old dog new tricks kind of person, really. And that's kind of the beat. It's just built up of various claps and rims. So once I've got my drums kind of rolling how I want, I will generally group all the percussive elements, including the clap, to a bus or a sum, which is what they call it on Logic, which essentially everything's now going through one channel. And I do this because I feel like to gel the sounds, it's good. I like to kind of limit all the percussion together. I just feel like it gels everything a little bit more together. You can also obviously then make sure nothing's clipping or nothing's jumping out in this section. I also like to make sure that, you know, there's a nice stereo image, not get rid of the two bottom bands, just because again, I find if there's too much stereo going on down there, it overcomplicates the bottom end, especially for house music. Maybe if you're making something else, that's not a rule you want to stick to, but if you're going to play it in the club, generally you want your bottom end to be mono, because you don't want it to phase or do anything like weird when you're dropping it. And then yeah, so it's very basic. I use the Isotope stuff. I love these things. I've actually added a tiny bit of an exciter on here. The alloy plug-in is great for this. It's so simple. You can add a tiny bit of drive again, which just makes it kind of punch a bit more, and the tape, and then the limiter's very. It's all. I like the fact, a bit like the SSL. This is all in one. It doesn't take up too much processing by adding tons and tons of different plugins to essentially do what you can do just out of that one. Here I've got two filters on here. I don't know why. I think one of them's a mistake, but this essentially is just your basic cut-off filter going on right there. Nothing too complicated. Just fills in the back. Just fills in the you know, nice little effects to bring things in and out of the breakdown. And I'll come on to the, maybe I'll do the effects now. Effects, very similar to how I do the drums in a lot of ways. I get all the effects together. These are just standard white noises, nothing special about them. I prefer using samples because it's quicker. These days I'm a lot about workflow. I can spend hours making an effect I like, but then, you know, there's so many good things around these days that I've already got a sound that is perfect for it. So you can call it cheating. I don't really care. That's fine. But I just prefer. I'd rather carry on making the record and feeling the melody and the rhythm than thinking, well, you know, I've got to spend all this time. I get very bored as well quite quickly. Most of my tracks normally only take me about 8 to 12 hours, maybe even quicker, depending on what the track is and what it's meant to do. On the bus on that, just a simple compressor, just again to gel these sounds together, to kind of control the levels on everything as well, so nothing kind of sticks out too much. And the FX is very simple in this record, to be honest with you. It's just some builds and some drop effects. Maybe a bit boring, but you know, I'd rather, especially with this record in particular, I wanted to spend more time on the musical elements than anything else really. So that's another reason why I just used very basic effects. I found it didn't need anything else. It drops very nicely. So the most interesting part of this record for me really was building up the musical elements. Now, going back to what I said about using loops, I actually I wanted a bed, the music to kind of write to. So I found this sample. I've resampled this after I've cut it all together and kind of looped it out. So there will be more processing on it. Unfortunately, it's not actually in that strip, but I can guess it's taken a lot of the top end off and used reverb and kind of filtered it around. But so I started with that anyway, so that set the tone. I wanted it to be kind of a deep, epic thing that was quite full. I then added these nice roads. Again, I've resampled these and just looped them. I kind of, when I'm writing music, I like to have a bed of sound already there to fill it out. Sometimes I'll take that away if what I've then written doesn't need it, but I kind of like to do that because it instantly makes me kind of feel the track. This actually has a nice bit of grit to it, which I kind of like. It's not perfect, you know. It sounds like it's kind of overlapping itself and making some mistakes. Everything these days is too perfect in my opinion, and you know, a lot of the best music in the world has so many good mistakes in it, especially when it comes to old house records. And then I remembered, you know, I've been making a lot of music where I've just been pissing around with bass and stuff, and actually I like the music element. So here's some strings that I've played in. It just I kind of started off with that riff and just thought, you know, it's a cool little melody. It kind of adds a lot to it. This is Omnisphere. So yeah, the strings are an Omnisphere. I can't recommend this synth enough for anybody. It's kind of it's a decent amount of money, but it has everything you would need in it. It is quite CPU heavy though, so for this I haven't used it much in this track, but if I'm using this a lot, I'll get a sound that I like and then bounce it and then use the audio, so then I can free up some CPU for using more of these. Basically, I do tend to use kind of the same synths time and again. Omnisphere is one of them. I use a lot of the Arturia stuff quite regularly as well, and then just Contact for samples as well if they're going to be playing a melody. I find that's better than the Logic, EXS, although I still have a lot of sound in that. So anyway, yeah, so I started with this riff over the drums because I realised I wanted to actually bring some music back into my records, and just basically built it up. If I go to the main section, added a lower string. I like to kind of, if I've got 2 layers of string, I like to always put the bass on a different one, because I feel like I always like to EQ it a little bit differently, or add or take away. For example, this reverb, I use this a lot. I mean, I think it was like $50 or something like that. Ridiculous. Like the Sound Toys stuff is just, I love it basically. And this in particular is a great little plate reverb, and it just adds instant depth to any sounds, especially strings and pianos. So I've just added that. Whereas on the bass, I didn't want this reverb, because I again didn't want it to kind of cloud the bottom end. Whereas obviously from the top it didn't have that much. And then the piano. Again, Sound Toys. I can't recommend these stuff enough, really. They're just so good. I feel like if you bought the Sound Toys stuff, you don't really need that much else in terms of effects processing, because this is great, the reverb's great, the distortion, there's some nice filters and all that kind of nonsense in there as well. For the actual sound, I've used the Niels Fram Una Corda piano, which has like a lovely, you can hear the hammer on it, which is kind of different from just your normal typical, Alicia Keys plugin or whatever. And it adds, again, that extra depth for me to the sound. If we listen to it, just the music together, this is just following that, so nothing too complicated. I have then all bust these together, because I see this music as one element, especially in a house record. I want to control them all together, and I kind of want them all to gel. If I was maybe writing something else and it had lots of different musical elements, I probably wouldn't do this. But for this record, which is not only about this, but about the chuggy nature of the bass, I wanted to make sure that it fit into a particular space, so I could then have the bass and whatever from the percussion kind of taking over the other aspects. So on the bus in the music, I've actually done quite a bit of processing on this. I love this compressor by Waves, the H compressor. I've actually turned all the analog off, but if you're kind of making something a bit dirty, like the lo-fi stuff, it has a lovely like just hum on it, which obviously doesn't fit in with this because it's a bit cleaner, but it's really good. It's kind of like an old vintage valve thing, which I love. Decapitator as well, going back to the Sound Toys. Here I've just used it to add a little bit of extra presence to the strings, and the piano, it's not doing that much really. I also kind of like the EQ on here, even though it's very basic. You can cut that bottom end very, very easily. And again, added another reverb because I'm obsessed with this thing and use it all the time, and I just love the way it sounds. I very rarely use anything other than this reverb these days, or the plate reverb from Logic, unless I want something stylistically to be different. But I find that for basic reverbs, you know, you can't go wrong with either of those. They sound so rich, especially the Sound Toys one, and the other one is just great for drums, basically. And then I've added this, which is not something that I normally use, but this is just modulating the sound a little bit and kind of giving everything a natural width to it. I mean, the sounds kind of already have a little bit of width to them anyway, because they're good quality sounds, especially from Omnisphere, but this for me just adds, you know, that extra depth to the sound. When I was making this, I wanted to make sure that, you know, when this string section came in, it kind of sounded like a proper string or orchestral section, and it had that rich, you know, feeling to it that I didn't want, you know, your standard kind of your soft synth sound, which is why Omnisphere was so good for it, because it just adds that extra layer of richness. And then this, I think I've just used a preset on this, to be honest with you. Yep, and it just added that extra element. Yeah, not really done too much to it really. Again, maybe just cheating a little bit, but if it does what I want it to do, then who cares, right? Like, you can get bogged down in it. So the kind of last musical element I did was actually on my Juno, Alpha Juno, which isn't set up right now. I find Logic very finicky and rubbish for hardware, I have to say. It's not always as intuitive as it should be, which is my only downside of this, which is why I still use this auto load that I've had since I was 17, because they're all set up and ready. Otherwise I can't be bothered to go into environment and do all that crap every time. But this is just my bog standard Juno. Again, Echo Boy, play. You know, I used to get in the habit of completely over. This channel would have probably had about 15 different effects and compressors and all this other crap that I never needed. And actually, it's kind of better to let the sound do the talking, maybe, especially with this kind of music, than anything else, really. And then everything kind of, a little switch on the rhythm there, on the pizzicato, just to make things a bit more interesting. Something I have done to this, obviously, when I record it in, I have recorded it in as mono. So to give it that extra width, I use the sample delay, just nudge it a little bit, give it, I mean, how many? 329 milliseconds there. Or samples, maybe, if that's the unit I'm using for that one. It literally just nudges one part of it forward. I'm sure you know all about that already if you're watching this, but if you don't, that's a great way to make mono things sound a bit more stereo and kind of stand out, and also give them their own space in a mix. If everything's straight down the centre, everything's colliding with each other and fighting for that space. A bit like EQing, I find that panning really helps give things its own room. But nothing really too drastically complicated about that sound. And then, yeah, I wanted to make something that was kind of had that epic feel to it. And so I feel like, you know, adding the strings and the piano are really the major element in this record. And the last sound is just a generic pad. No, there's not much to say about that really. Here's the original sound. I have resampled it. My computer now is getting on a bit. He's a bit of an old man, so the CPU does get abused quite a lot, especially as this is originally an Omnisphere sound, like the strings. So I bounced it down to audio. Also, I found more recently, even more so in other music that I've made after this, I like bouncing the melody down into audio, because then I can cut it up and play with it like a sample, something that you can't do if it's just MIDI, you know, MIDI notes or whatever. It's very hard to kind of cut that up and make it interesting. Whereas if you have audio, you can cut it up and move it around a lot easier and make interesting sounds. Obviously, this being a pad, I haven't done that, but it's just your bog standard pad. just to fill out the space and to create a kind of thicker sound. That was a lot of what I wanted to do in this record. It's why I've left the beds, which normally I might take away once I've got the strings going. I wanted that full, rich sound. Again, with the going back to the bass line, you know, just finding the sample and hearing kind of how thick it was already. I was like, well, you know, I don't really need to add much to this. I was going to add a sub. I tried a little sub line, but it all just took away from the chug of the record, which is something that I really wanted to do. What else is there to say, really? The vocals, there's some nice ones from Splice of Gene Farris, so big up to Gene. And for me, they're more rhythmical than actually being, you know, an element that you're going to remember. They just add something that catches the ear every bar, basically. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. And then a little another little splice thing. In terms of vocals, actually, for me, this is very small. I normally love to use vocals, a bit like how I like to resample things. Vocals you can cut up. I mean, I'm from a garage background, so I love a vocal cut anyway. But for this record, it didn't need it. It's a bit like when I was making it, I was thinking of an old record I made called I Want You, which actually I think might have been the last one I did of these, which had a lot of musical elements in it. And the musical elements drove the track, and the vocals were kind of an afterthought in terms of what they were going to do on the record. I think the vocals here I added last, after I'd already created most of the record. One thing that I will go into, which is something, again, I don't know if they do it in Ableton. I should really probably try and learn it, but I can't be bothered. For this record, not so much, because it's quite a straight up, you know, very much that kind of almost a marching like nature to the bass and the kick drum. I haven't used it much. I wanted it to be quite static, but a lot of the time I will use this on Logic and create my own swing and use this as a swing. Obviously it comes with your presets, but I just feel like, and again, maybe this is coming from a garagey background, they don't quite offer either the amount of swing, or they're too much, or they just feel a bit forced. So I'll either use this for a swing. As you can see, it just kind of moves it a little tiny bit off the 16th, which gives it a natural kind of swagger, in my opinion, is how I like to describe it. Or I will do it myself. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's completely off. If it sounds good, it sounds good. For this record, it didn't sound good, so I didn't use it. But I make sure that when I do use swing, the swing is maintained in all the loops. As you can see, this loop is very flat and very straightforward. Same with this. This other little kind of backbeat is what I would call it, which is just, you know, your standard kind of, I mean, it doesn't really do anything, but it fills out the beat. But if something's swinging, and say you have a rim shot that's really swung and then a loop that's not, it's going to clash and sound bad. So even if you have to spend a bit of extra time going into the loop, cutting it up and making sure that it all swings in the same way, it will definitely give your track a kind of smoother, cleaner feel to things. Another thing I have added here is bongos, which actually kind of, these bongos in particular, I should have mentioned this, kind of work off the bass. And almost, not quite, but almost a little kind of call and response thing with the bass and the bongos. It's not quite that, but it kind of adds an extra layer to the bass, in my opinion, even though I've grouped it in with all the percussion, because, you know, I'm traditional like that, and it is percussion. And then, yeah, that's about it, really. The effects, again, just splice or samples, crash, nothing too complicated there. Those bongos are just from a loop that I've cut out, actually, I think. I would have got rid of the original loop. And one last thing, actually, to get the kind of techno-y claps, rolling the clap, rather than playing it in. Logic have now got a great thing which is meant for arpeggios, but it works so well with percussion, and it's so easy, and you can just kind of, you know, play it stupidly easy, and it saves you so much time in like getting it wrong and then having to go in and quantize it and all that kind of rubbish. So I use this quite a lot actually. I use it for putting in hats as well, and sometimes other bits. And here, you know, you could, again, going back to the swing, like you can create your own swing with that, which is great. I really like this edition actually, which I think is new for X or 9 or whatever. But I use that a lot on percussion. It's an instant way of kind of creating those big room claps that a lot of people are using these days, especially in techno and this kind of like, I don't know what you would call it, tech house music, whatever. And that's basic. Bit of space echo on those claps, just to give it a bit of an interesting delay. And yeah, that's about it really. I've tried to pull back on processing too much on a lot. I mean, there's a lot on these in terms of reverbs and stuff, but I used to just use loads of different plugins to do something that essentially could be done for the same thing. On the master channel, going into that quickly, I've just pushed up the bass. This master channel, I don't always do as much, but there was just some frequencies here which I really hated, which were cutting through. This fab filter is a great thing, because you can literally listen in to exactly the frequency which is killing your ears and get rid of it. And then just a bit of compression. And then for my own, when I want to play things out before it's mixed or mastered even, I just use an L2. I just use an L2, push it, bring it down a couple of notches there so it's not clipping or whatever, just so it kind of has the same level as everything else I'm playing that's been fully kind of released or whatever. And that's about that. So this has been Huxley, and you've been checking out how I created Evolution. It's coming out in March on Knee Deep in Sound. I hope you like the way I muddled through my creation, and thank you for watching.